So yeah, thank you. What I'm going to present now is a very small part of my research that I did in the last years in Malaysia. And this is about the use of video tracking to understand sublethal thermal effect on freshwater macroinvertebrates larvae. So my talk is going to be way more focused on the application rather than the video tracking itself. This is going to be a very small part in my talks. So let me start my story from here. So I was a few months ago along the Baleh River with my colleagues that I want to thank at the beginning of my presentation from Sarawak Energy, University of Nottingham, Malaysia. And we were along the Baleh River, that is one of the last large free-flowing river in the Borneo, Malaysia, because the Malaysian government has a plan, is developing a big hydropower infrastructure along the Baleh River. And we've been involved as institutions to try to understand what will be the impact of the construction of these dams on the downstream part of the Baleh River. And what we've been working mainly was to developing to the so-called functional flows. Maybe you're already familiar with those, but basically are flows at which the dam can be operated that kind of minimize the impact in the downstream area of the river. And I mean, those functional flows include many aspects, from the hydrology to the morphology of the river to the suspended sediment, and that was my field, the thermal habitat as well. So my goal was kind of trying to understand what flows would have maintained at least the suitability, the thermal suitability for the freshwater habitat. So I'm going to give a very small idea of how we measure the habitat thermal suitability. Maybe for many of you this would be like very basic stuff that you already know, but yeah. So when we measure the thermal suitability, we usually refer to the thermal performance of individuals. And for the moment, don't think what this performance is measuring, but how this curve usually looks something like that. And it basically describes the performance of, let's say, individuals at different temperature. We can characterize this curve by a few points. For example, one is the thermal optimum, that is the temperature at which the performance is maximized. We have the two minimums, so the thermal minimum and the thermal maximum, that are the two temperatures at which the performance is 0. And what you can very basically understand is that while we move on this curve, the individuals is suffering an increase in thermal stress. So as I said, the performance can be measured over many traits. One is survival, for example. We have metabolic trait, growth trait, X survival. So this is just example, really. The last three are measures that can be directly applicable to a real life concrete context, but still to characterize the curve for those three usually is very time consuming. It requests equipment. Mainly we need like a laboratory experiment over several generations. And so what many times is done is to test the so-called survival performance with what is called the critical thermal limit experiment. That is very basically is a relatively simple experiment when, in the case of in freshwater context, what you need is a water bath where you test your individual. Usually a normal procedure is to leave them for an equilibrium temperature for a certain time, and then you increase the water temperature of a certain rate until they reach the thermal maximum. And so you know that is the point of zero performance, so they basically died. Given that is a relatively simple experiment, the measure of critical thermal maximum and as well thermal minimum is literature is used as a sort of proxy or estimation of thermal suitability of certain habitat for certain taxa or certain communities, but as well to estimate the risk derived for the thermal alteration of those habitat, and as well by comparing the value of critical thermal maximum of different population, we can try to understand some acclimatization processes. But still, the number itself, so the critical thermal maximum, is an estimate of an extreme thermal stress point that is very unlikely to be reached in nature. So many freshwater in larvae has critical thermal maximum that are above 35, many times above 40 degrees Celsius, that are temperatures that we don't really expect to find in nature. So, yes. So let me come back in Borneo. We were there, we were sampling. Our question was, can we understand something a bit more precise rather than just this extreme number of CTmax for our habitat? And we were in a situation where we didn't have any long-term water temperature records. We have a limited access to equipment, logistical limitation. And this is not just because we were in Borneo, I think, but it's a pretty common situation in many experiments where we have limitation of equipment, access to time limitation. So my question was, can we understand more than just simply the critical thermal maximum during a critical thermal maximum experiment? So during a critical thermal maximum experiment, this is the water, but an individual, I hope you can spot it in this very bad quality video on the right, clearly can move if it has space to move. And my question was, can we use the movement pattern of the individual during the experiment to establish potential sublethal thermal effect? So I'm just gonna very briefly run through the experiment itself. So we did a simple critical thermal maximum experiment in our water bath where we left individuals for 15 minutes at equilibrium, and we then started heating the water of 1 degree each 5 minutes until they reached their critical thermal maximum. But again, we left the individual free to move within the water bath. We tested the maximum of 3 individuals at the time of the same taxa, and we take just very basically a video of the experiment with a phone. And this all where my video tracking comes in. I use a software called Loopy to track the movement of the individual during the CTmax experiment, using the center of the body as the reference. So I'm going to present here the test of 3 taxa, 2 different Elmidae and 1 Perlidae that have respectively a critical thermal maximum 47, 40, and 42 degrees. And so how I characterize the movement? At the moment, it's characterized as the cumulative space covered by the individual each minute. So on the x-axis, you have the experiment time. So when we look at the pattern of movement, we have in the first 15 minutes where we have the equilibrium temperature for all the 3 taxa, they immediately start moving continuously, increasingly. Then the pattern changed. It's very different for all the taxa. And they will keep moving during the experiment until they reach their respective critical thermal maximum. So we have the first Elmidae here, the Perlidae, and the last Elmidae at the end. So then what I did was to see, okay, I said, okay, we have the trend here that here are modeled with an additive model. So where I modeled the cumulative space as a function of the experiment time. And I try to identify by analyzing the first derivative of those trends where there was significant point of trend changes. I'm not going to go into the details of those analyses, but I don't think it's relevant here maybe now. Clearly the first point was at 25. So all the 3 trends, even if with different magnitude, they decreasing their movement when we start increasing the temperature of the water. The second point of variation was very different in absolute in times, clearly, so at different temperatures, but still quite consistently across the 3 taxa. It was roughly 12 degrees before the critical thermal maximum value for each of the 3. Even more interesting, the third point was 3.5 degrees Celsius before the CTmax, the critical thermal maximum value, And the last point was 1.6 degrees Celsius. And getting closer to the CTmax, those values were even more consistent across taxa. So we actually, for each of those, identified some potential point when we saw a significant variation in the movement pattern. So what I want to do next? In light of what I saw today, I think it would be very interesting to test more detailed tracking of their behavior. For example, we tested some annelide. They have a completely different way of moving. I think it would be very interesting to have multiple points, as I saw many super nice stuff today. So this is going to be something that I would do. And another thing is, I mean, these now are just points. I would be very interested to try to understand if there is a correspondence, what correspondence there is at these values of temperature and physiological changes in the individuals. And clearly we have to test more individual, different taxa to have like more robust evaluation of those mechanisms. And yeah, I'm happy to take any feedback from you, and thank you.